Hello and welcome to Think About Gender, a podcast presenting thought-provoking questions from real opinions. My name is Selena Chen, and today we're with Eshaal. Hi Eshaal, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Eshaal. I am a senior at Stuyvesant High School, meaning I'm almost an adult. That's scary.
First question is, what career are you looking forward to / pursuing?
It's a career that when people meet me, they're like, why? I want to be a physician at some point in the future, so a doctor. And there's a number of reasons for it, and I think the best way I can talk about it is by talking about what people assume I want to be, which is I've had people look at me and be like, you seem like the pre-law kind of kid, like a lawyer, or like, I don't know, my parents are like, oh, you're going to be a politician one day. They're not particularly happy about that notion. But it's actually physician, because I've just been into biology for such a long time. When I was little, I would get into my mom's like medical textbooks, and I didn't understand anything, but it was super cool. She would get me these plushies, but they were shaped like different viruses. So that was really interesting. So just for a very long time, biology's been like one of my favorite subjects. I do want to be a physician one day, but I don't want to abandon humanities entirely. So people assume like I'm going to go into law or something because like I do speech. That's what I do. I'm a speech champion. I like writing. I like research. That's the bulk of my extracurriculars. But I also shadowed at a hospital this summer, and that kind of really solidified, like when I was in that ER in the office, I'm like, I want to be here a couple of years from now.
Well, I really like how you're pursuing both STEM and humanities. I think it really offers a diverse perspective. And so my question is, how do you feel like pursuing these two different fields have affected your passion, and how they have been offering you opportunities as in terms of your identity? And do you feel affected by your gender when it comes to either fields?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So pursuing both has definitely been a journey. I think it was just this year that I realized that I didn't have to just pick one, because a lot of people assume like if you're going to medicine, then in college you need to major in like, biomedical technology or whatever it is, engineering. But you can major in whatever you want to, and as long as you do the required med courses, like also as a part of the track, then it's fine. So you can major in literally anything and still be a pre-med student, which I did not know until very recently. So it's been interesting, and I think it's also guided my college search, because now I'm really interested in colleges that promote interdisciplinary learning. So they won't really, look at me weird, or like I won't have too much of a hard time if I want to like jump between different kinds of classes. And when it comes to women in these two fields, I feel like that's a very interesting question. I think academics for a long time has been gate kept by men in general, regardless of the subject. Which is interesting to me, because even in things like writing for a very long time, there have been very like snooty people who are like, we can't have like, teenage girls tainting like, things like, even like music. Like you can see it in how things that teenage girls enjoy, like they're viewed as less academic when they're just as profound. I think humanities recently has been kind of seen as more of the girly thing to do. If I'm looking at which one tends to lean to openness, because I think now there's this attitude towards humanities that's very fluid, and it's kind of a new way of looking at it, where we view, for example, English, like now it's like if you're not reading stories written by underrepresented groups and minorities, then we wouldn't really qualify that as like a robust English course, right? Like both at like Stuyvesant, but especially in higher education. So I think that for that reason, that fluidity, I think gender is just more accepted as, first off, gender is accepted as like the spectrum more often in the humanities space, but it's also a little less roadblock to women. And I think the place I see this right now is actually in Stuy's like AP English classes, where I think last year and this year, like a bunch of my friends and I were talking about this, where we noticed that there tended to be like more participation from the females in those classes. And it was an interesting observation that I kind of agreed with. And I was wondering like why. So that was interesting. I don't know if that's the same in like college. When it comes to medicine, medicine has been getting a lot more. I don't want to use the word woke because that's just been co-opted by so many interesting groups. Mm-hmm. But it's been getting more and more open, which I appreciate. And actually, in my internship this summer, I think like 7 of the 8 people there were girls, which is really, I was like, ooh. I think that where it now in medicine, where it could probably get more roadblock to women, isn't necessarily in like, it's less about people directly telling you like you're a girl so you can't be a doctor, and it's more about like the little micro things mm-hmm. that make it harder. So like to this day, like my mom, like she's the doctor I look up to most. Like she's amazing. She worked through the pandemic like pregnant. It was crazy. Oh. And she didn't have to, and she did because she just loves her job that much. But it's like, to this day, like she's the director of her department in the hospital, and residents will still come in and be like, so are you an intern? You know?
Actually, that is...
Yeah, or like they'll make conversation with her and she'll wonder like, why is this person being so casual with me? You know, like mm-hmm. I'm the, you know, there's a level of hierarchy in medicine, you work your way up, and then they find out she's like the department chair and they're like, huh? And it's originally I kind of understood because it's like she did look quite young, and she's like pretty young for the position she's in, but at this point it's just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So it's those little micro things that aren't outright sexist, but it's like they don't really happen to men.
Mm. Yeah. I love how you just like went through almost all of the questions that I have, but it's like
my bad.
It's okay. Well, how do you feel like the small things, like the small microaggressions against women in STEM or humanities, and like how you talked about your mother who faced like indirect gender bias and presumably thought that like she wasn't a director because she was a woman? How do you feel like that has been like a part of your experience, and do you feel affected by it?
Yeah, I think that the stereotypes definitely still exist, just not in the same way that I think we used to think. So I think that most of that kind of prejudice comes from people who are more traditionally minded, which in Gen Z, I don't think there is as a large of a demographic of those kind of people, but I could be biased because we both live in New York, so New York is particularly, so just based on my experience. But there are certain things, like, for example, I'm thinking of makeup, like, so I do speech, right? And it's like, there's this notion where, so in speech and debate, you really have to dress up, like you wear a suit, you look your best and stuff. And the one thing that the girls in speech and debate have to deal with is like the makeup, like constantly retouching it, doing it, if they choose to. But there's definitely this emphasis on like, it's more in speech than debate, to be honest, but presentation matters. Mm-hmm. And then I think subconsciously lots of judges and even like audience members, and probably me at some point with internal bias, like was like, you have to look put together for your speech to feel put together, which is kind of reasonable until it gets to like, I've heard people getting ranked down because the judge was like, oh, your skirt was like a little on the shorter side, or like or even if they don't say it, you can kind of tell like what the reasons were. So those little things. But then there are some people who think, oh, if you aren't wearing makeup, that means you're prioritizing the right things. So it's getting more complicated. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to explain it, but the stereotypes are getting more complicated. So it's more difficult to navigate. And like I said, it's like on a more micro level where no one's coming out and saying just like, I don't think you're as dedicated because you're wearing makeup or something like that. It's more of you kind of notice differences like tiny ones and how you're treated, and then you feel like you're gaslighting yourself. You're just like, no way, you know.
I think what you said is really interesting. I think I've definitely considered that, like how people indirectly hint about like the gender bias and like the more traditional mindset, and I especially think that it was amazing that you brought up your experience with women in speech having to do makeup or trying to dress well to fit into like certain sets of like standards. I totally agree with you. I think especially in our generation where like everything can be really sensitive and everyone tries to be more careful about what they're saying, it becomes more indirect in a way and everything becomes less obvious, and it's really hard to like maneuver around if it actually is gender bias or not. So then my next question is, do you feel like you yourself hold any implicit biases against women in pre-med or in poli-sci?
I like that question. That's a tough question. Okay, some self-reflection here.
Yes.
Yeah, so
You can take
yeah,
a
no,
moment to think about it. You don't have to like.
yeah. I'm kind of trying to trace back because I think I, like many other people, did go through that, like, I'm not like other girls, like, you know, that in elementary school and all that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, I don't like pink. Who am I kidding? I love pink. But, I think I really like this question. I think everybody should get asked this question. I guess I have this kind of notion in my head where I would draw back to the speech thing, where I do think that there is at least some remnant of that bias of like, look put together and then you'll feel put together and your speech will be put together. It's like not a strand of hair out of place. And I think it's kind of, okay, so I'm going to start with like my personal experience, which is I had like the glow up of a century. I have to be totally real here. In middle school, oh my God, I was wearing like a BTS sweatshirt everywhere I went. My hair was like super long, but it was everywhere. It was so damn, like, I don't think my personality changed all that much, but my goodness, it's a train wreck, like, when I look back at those photos. And then I look very, very different now, and that's because, like, you know, I started having the energy to, like, you know, plan stuff I wore, and I like, took joy and confidence in it. But then I guess that also contributed to this notion in my head of, like, appear better, it shows more effort, which I think is the wrong way to go. Like, yeah, that's not exactly true, because it does take effort, true, to get, like, ready every morning, but that doesn't detract or, like, add to how much you should be, like, respecting somebody, right? Like, and I don't think that it should be a reason to put down people who don't have the time or, like, you know, who have the want to do that kind of stuff. So that's something inside me that I think I did start noticing after I entered high school, and I was like, I haven't really thought about it too much, so I'm glad I have this question, because now I will be sitting with that at 3 a.m. thinking about it.
Not 3 a.m.
No, but it's a good thing. It is good. I should be thinking about it. And yeah, so that kind of bias of, like, somebody, you know, the ultimate achievement is to have it all, like, to put effort into your work and, like, your personal relationships and, like, you know, in your appearance and stuff. And that's a bias that not only, it's like an unfair bias to have in terms of other people, but it puts a lot of pressure on myself too. Because when I'm not doing those things, I feel like, okay, there's always another thing I could be doing to achieve this, like, final state of being. But that's not true. It's, you know, if I don't have time to get ready in the morning, like, that's okay. And that's something I've been kind of leaning into more this year, but it's been very hard to kind of let go of that, because that, you know, that's also like a form of internalized, like, sexism. But it kind of stems from like after I think after like appearance wise like started changing a little bit, and especially after I entered the speech and debate space where like you kind of have to look put together. Like I did notice I was getting treated a little better in certain ways. Like it wasn't like anyone was mean to me beforehand, but it's like people voluntarily talk to me more. So that kind of reinforced that notion in my head of like, oh, so this is because I put more effort in. But it's not because of that. It's because we all have the internal bias that like looking put together means like this person is respectable, which is not true. And I think that's a barrier to many otherwise great friendships that could take place.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I feel like the idea of internalized bias is definitely true, and how we present ourselves really shows to people like what personality we have, which is not always true, and like how people perceive shy and more timid, or people who prefer to be by themselves as more introverted, which is not always true, because like being yourself doesn't mean you have to be like set in stone about like what you are, and it's really like fluid in terms of who you are, and it's not just, oh, you are shy so you're introverted, and you are outgoing so you're extroverted. It's not like a dividing line, and I totally agree with you in terms of like internalized bias that everyone has, because everyone holds their own like idea of a person because of like personal experience. So I feel like all these gender biases are like can really affect a person. So that leads to my next question. Do you feel like gender bias affects you and your career and your confidence in pursuing pre-med and poli-sci?
Yeah. So this is actually something I put in one of my college essays. So yeah, there was a place in one of my essays, I don't recall, where I referenced the fact that, okay, if you look at my transcript and my extracurriculars and all that, you're not going to see that much like medically based stuff. And like I tell colleges I want a major poli-sci, but I also want to do a pre-med track. And so a lot of my application is convincing them like, yes, I'm worthy of that pre-med track. So like if you look back, I don't have that much involvement in like medical studies and stuff. And that's not necessarily because I didn't have the opportunity to do so, but it was more so I thought I had to like pick one. And then I wrote, and I feel this, that part of me wants to go down that path because I kind of want a sense of legitimacy for myself to be pursuing that field. Because I feel like right now, like, so I am a 5'4", South Asian girl who makes like really, like, I have a very like jokey personality. I don't know. I have been described as like bubbly and stuff like that. And all that's well and fun, but then when people see that, they don't think like, oh, she's going to be a physician, right? They're going to be like, oh, like, you know, she's talkative. She's going to go into a, like, you know, law or something like that. And that has definitely discouraged me because it makes me feel like, you know, what if part of that is right? What if this is kind of like a waste of my natural like personality and stuff? But then I guess I kind of had this epiphany over the summer, especially, where I was like, well, if you kind of restrict like girls with perhaps quote girlier personalities or people with bubbly personalities from ever working in STEM ever, then that's also a detriment to the STEM field, I would say. Because you need that variety of perspectives. But yeah, I definitely felt like because of my personality and kind of like how I fit in with like my identity as a woman, like it didn't really fit with my mental image of what it meant to be a physician. So I was discouraged for a little bit, and I honestly, for a long time, I figured I'm like, I'm just gonna go into law or writing or something, you know, even though I knew that I would be really sad if I didn't get to do biology ever or like health science. But then thankfully we have great guidance counselors and like college support and stuff. And then they kind of help me unpack that. They're like, you can do both, right? And that's not a valid reason to like not do what you want to do. But yeah, I find it interesting that even though like I have been lucky enough to not have like many sexist encounters like happen to me, there's just so much internally created by like these systems and these notions. So yeah.
I think the point that you bring up is very interesting. It's like we ourselves are our own enemies at times, and I totally agree with you. And we have to remember that sometimes it's us that is our own limiting factors and not always someone else. And so my question is, do you feel like the people around you support you and help you, or are they more on like the negative end in terms of what you are trying to pursue based on your identity?
It's very mixed. I think half the time it's just straight confusion. Like, wait, you can do that? Like, that's a thing. And I have to explain, like, yes, pre-med is not a major. It's a track. I can, take the MCAT. I don't have to, like, and then the other half is kind of just like, oh, wow, you're doing a lot. And I think it's that more positive note is kind of just like, oh, wow, it's kind of like in the nicest way possible. People are like, oh, you try hard. like you're trying to do everything at once. Which is kind of true, but it comes out of, like, I would say I'm a workaholic, but this is not something coming out of workaholicism. This is something coming out of, like, I genuinely want to do both. And I've been learning more about how they actually bridge, like, political science and healthcare. I think the people who get it most are actual doctors. Like, my mom has friends in the field who, like, sometimes I'll visit her office and we'll have, like, nice little chats. And, like, I have friends who are doing pre-med and, like, are in med school. And then I'll fill them in, they're like, that is so cool. You could do, like, healthcare policy, which is this field I didn't know existed. It's, like, the actual creation of different policies and, like, interactions between, like, healthcare and the government and stuff like that. I'm like, that's so cool. I don't think I'm going to do that, but that's so cool. So it makes more sense to people who are already familiar with pre-med. And then those who aren't as familiar, they're either just like, what? Or they're like, of course you're doing, like, two completely different things at once, you workaholic. But I do feel pretty supported. I feel like for the most part, people are like, oh, it's a pretty cool thing. But then it comes after this arc of just, like, pure confusion. Last year, my English teacher was like, wait, you want to do pre-med? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, you struck me as, like, that pre-law to law school pipeline, And I'm like, I get that a lot.
Yeah, like what you said, not everyone is like always supported, even with our closest friends. It takes time for people to get around it and sometimes like wrap around that this person's actually serious about pursuing this. And I think it's fair to like give this time for people to really process it. But at the same time, if it keeps reoccurring over time, it does get really annoying. So I just want to ask if you have anything else you want to say, such as like any negative feedbacks you've been getting or anything that you feel like should be talked about.
I think I pretty much covered it, to be honest. When it comes to, I think, gender especially, I think the specific kind of language that's used should change. So, like, when people, even when they don't mean it, I think it's good to be, like, mindful of for example, the adjectives. Like, I've heard this thing, I'm just going to use, like, medical evaluations, but it applies to, like, even people, like, our age, like, when you're talking to them about how people work. So if you go into, like, medical evaluations, there have been a couple studies that found, like female doctors, like, capable ones, like, they'll be described as, like caring, like, involved, stuff like that. while the male doctors of like the same caliber will be like efficient, like focused, and it's like they're very minor differences that really add up to how I think women are viewed in that space. But even on like our level of like school, like something like group projects, right? Like the number of times I have heard like in our student government or like in group projects, like people calling other girls like, oh yeah, she's kind of bossy, or just like, oh yeah, she's like kind of commanding people to do these things, like, and so it's just the little changes in language where it's like, come to think of it. Which, by the way, I've heard that pretty much every major club this year is led by a girl at Stuyvesant, which is crazy, and I think the spec is doing an article about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like the entirety of the student union, I think, like speech and debate, the spectator editor, it's like it's crazy. Everything is like women run this year. So it's been interesting, like kind of seeing how, people discuss these girls as opposed to like if a dude was running them. And the most annoying part, I think, is that dudes don't even notice. It's the girls who notice. You're just like, huh, you wouldn't say that if like the dude were the one in charge. And then they're like, what? No, I totally would. It's just like,
Well, I just read something about it actually, that like in Japan in high schools, a survey was conducted and that like talking about gender stereotypes, and so how like a boy or a girl would describe another boy or a girl, and so most commonly girls would be described as like gentle and kind, and then boys will be more like sportsy and active. And I think it's like really like this categorization of like feminine vs like masculine words that I think is very interesting. So I think that like we as a society should like pay attention to what we say, and but it's also like how we grow up. Like in this time, everyone, boys and girls, have like different perspectives on gender bias, and also like different backgrounds that influence our biases or allows us like shield it from these biases. So I think it's really interesting. Well, my next question is, Ishal, what is your motivation?
my motivation to study what I want to and to pursue this career. Self-fulfillment. I've spent so much of my life just being anxious, like not knowing how to navigate, especially because like I think I'm a South Asian girl. I don't have that many role models. Like now I have some more role models, but even in like current diversity movements and stuff, I feel like South Asian people get left out. Like you have representatives from all these demographics, and then not really South Asian. And I know Southeast Asians have a similar issue. I think I've just been having so much anxiety and just like, what should I be doing? Am I like, am I doing makeup the right way? Like, am I studying what I'm supposed to? And now this like decision has come after like a lot of deep thought and kind of like a year of like me figuring out what exactly it is I want. So that's my motivation, just like self-fulfillment, just like, you know what, carelessly. This is like the one time I'm sure I'm just gonna do what I want, and then everyone else can kind of deal with it. And also my mom, because she's a girl boss. Like my grandpa was the first in his family to send his daughters to a co-ed school because it was like the best school in like the country, and like his daughters got in, and like his family shunned him for it, but he still sent them, and then they all turned out to be like these girl bosses who are excelling at their careers. So it's just kind of that model in my family, like that emphasis on education, like that's keeping me going. I'm just like, yeah, feminists.
I think it's amazing that you have a support system within your family, and I hope that you keep pursuing your career. Best of luck in poli sci and pre-med. And so I had a question while we were talking regarding your research into social equality in clinical research. So I'm just curious, like, what did you learn about like gender inequality, and what are your plans in furthering your research?
Yeah. So I think it's like pretty overlooked when we like socioeconomic inequality and then clinical research. I think when people are thinking like social inequality, they're thinking like, social studies research, psychological research and stuff, which by the way, that can also count as like clinical medical research if applicable. But I don't have as much experience in clinical research as I do in historical research. But one thing that's definitely true that I've learned this summer is not taking like women into account in these studies hurts women at the end. For example, let's say a clinical trial is being designed for like a drug, right? And this drug is for, I don't know, let's just say like a pain thing, right? And sometimes the sample groups aren't the most representative. Like they try to, but it doesn't always work out that way. And that's why you need like additional studies even after like the drug is approved and stuff. But we're like lacking those studies to see the effects they have on women. This is leading to like women being underdosed certain medications, overdosed certain medications, and there's also just not enough research about basic things like menstruation. We don't have the full story about what happens during pregnancy to like a woman's brain because those aren't the priorities. And like I think STEM is moving in a direction of like we're advancing so fast it's like scary. There are all these like cool new products, these like miracle drugs and stuff, but like we're not stopping to like make sure that they're impacting everyone in the community well. And I think that could be fixed by like more emphasis on those certain demographic groups. And I like encountered it this summer. Like I was doing some telemedical research on like hospital follow-ups, and long story short, after running like an analysis, it was like a socioeconomic analysis. That's the part I wanted to emphasize. In order to improve like those rates of online appointments, like people actually showing up, there's like this huge language barrier, which like, obviously physicians working on it knew about, but to get that in writing is really, really, really important because it helps you realize like exactly where you need to fix things. So similarly for gender inequality, it's not just like medication and like drugs. I read this thing where on the field, let's say somebody needs resuscitation, somebody needs CPR, and they're doing chest compressions. CPR tends to be less effective for women. And it's not because the CPR itself isn't working. It's because when like paramedics train, most of the dummies they're using don't actually have like female anatomy. So when it happens like in person, like subconsciously, they're not used to it. Like it might not be as effective. And that's not a product of like sexism, but it's just not keeping women in mind. So and it was a study that showed that. So I think like studies for that gap in socioeconomic like equality and like gender equality, like that leads to real results, like real people dying, real people living. Like it's important. That was the girl boss mom in question.
Yes, I saw. Okay, well, those were all really interesting points. Well, unfortunately, we don't have as much time to touch upon all of them. But
Yes.
just like one last question: how do you feel like there's room for improvement about like gender inequality, and how can we keep women in mind?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things I've noticed, and I think this is something that actually gets locked out of the feminist space a lot, is actually talking to like men about it. Because I'm pretty sure at some point, like, women, we know about our problems. We talk about our problems, we try to fix our problems. But ultimately, we have to also communicate with men. And they may not always listen. That's the infuriating thing. But I think there has been this thing of just like alienate men, alienate these other groups from discussions. And it's also led to like some disgusting, like, racism and homophobia within the feminist community. But excluding people from these conversations only hurts us more. Like, how are you going to expect, for example, like a guy to know about these issues if no one is talking to him about these issues, So that's just, and that's not to say like, it's like, oh, these poor men, like, but it's to say like we can't fix it unless we're having that open discussion. An example I can think of is like I think people tend to make fun of like teenage boys for not knowing much about periods, and at some point it is kind of ridiculous, like that our curriculum is failing them so much. But then I feel like this year I heard like a dude ask like one of his female friends like a question about it, and then he kind of got made fun of for not knowing the answer, which on one hand, okay, kind of funny, but on the other hand, it's like, then how will he ever learn? So I think it sounds like a kind of a betrayal to the feminist movement to say this, but we have to include men in these discussions because sometimes they frankly don't understand the repercussions of the things they do. And it works in all places of privilege. It's like, for example, I have certain amounts of privilege by attending Stuyvesant. And I think that it's important for me to be involved in discussions regarding people who are educationally disadvantaged so that I can understand where my privilege lies and I can help to fix it, And I think that's an important way to improve so that we can kind of work together to solve these kinds of issues. So, yeah.
Okay. Oh, I really like that as well. You bring up so much good points. I think it's really important that we really like communicate about these issues and really establish like education for everyone, because like a lot of it is a lack of like the resources to talk about this, or like even now like we are talking about it, but some people might not have like the experience to like be more familiar about these stuff. So
yeah, like men, they definitely know, like, sexual harassment exists and stuff like that. But I don't think they understand that every girl they've ever talked to has been harassed or has had some sort of creepy experience, right? And I think even just communicating that to them, then they'll be like, well, because a lot of them don't know, like they don't go around asking these things. So
I think it's also like society kind of shields people away from these. Thank you so much, Eshaal, for talking about your experience.
You have really good questions. Oh my god.
Really? Thank you.
Okay.
That's it for our episode today. I hope everyone looks forward to the next episode.